about shame, shame, shame. It's the name of her game. There's so much to do, and we're gonna speak true. So many to blame, blame, blame. Hello, everybody out there in podcast land, everybody out there in Chicago who is lucky enough to be listening to us today. We're going to give you a ton of information. We've got some great guests, and we've got some great stuff going on, and I'm going to let my good friend and podcast partner, Derek, talk to you about that.
So just as you guys have heard me belabor this point to death, but just so you know, once again, by the time you're watching this episode, our subscription program will be up and running. And today we have the distinguished honor to introduce Jason Wynkoop. He's the Chief Program Officer, Advocacy and Investigations. He leads the Advocacy and Investigative Services at the CAC and is responsible for supporting the intake, forensic interview, advocacy, and child life teams, as well as the oversight of the program development for Chicago Advocacy Network for Hope, or Can Hope, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is Can Hope. Remember that. It's a collaborative future service model for connecting the city's sexual and domestic violence survivors to the support that they need. He's been a licensed clinical social worker and supervisor for over 15 years. His professional focus has been on children, youth, and families, and includes work in community mental health, residential treatment, and policy and funding. Immediately prior to joining the Chicago CAC, he served as strategic policy advisor at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. His portfolio at ICJA, which we talked about, included trauma recovery centers and BOCA-funded initiatives. Definitely our topics, like Illinois Heals, a statewide demonstration project to improve service accessibility and engagement for children and youth impacted by violence. He's a graduate of Valparaiso University, earned a master's in social service administration from U of C, and is an alumnus of the Allstate Foundation's Executive Leadership Program. Bam.
Bam.
Impressive.
We are lucky enough to have two guests from Chicago Children's Advocacy Center with us today. We're going to start off with Jason, and he's going to talk about programs and funding, and we are going to talk more about that Can Hope campaign, because that's a biggie, and that's one of the reasons we're so delighted to have them here today. So, Jason, after that introduction, what should we be asking you? What do you want to tell us?
Yeah. Don't ask me anything. I mean, I think I was going to run out with laugh. That sounded really great.
Well, one of the things that we've talked to your executive director, Shar, about was the fact that, you represent something kind of different. Most of us here, the three of us here, our experiences have been with smaller Illinois ICASA agencies, and I have learned that you know a little bit about ICASA. So maybe why don't we start off today? Tell us a little bit about Chicago Children's Advocacy Center and what makes you different, what is your concentration, and what do you want people to know about you?
Sure. So Chicago Children's Advocacy Center is the only center in Chicago to coordinate the investigations for children who are alleged to be victims of child sexual abuse. So we do that for the entire city of Chicago at our location in the medical district. And so basically what our responsibility is that when law enforcement or the Department of Children and Family Services is investigating an incident of child sexual abuse, that's referred to our center, and our teams coordinate that family's arrival, coordinate all the investigative partners. And what we're trying to do is make sure that the experience that the families have is trauma informed, and we try to set them on the path for healing. And in doing all of that work that we do, one of the things that we've noticed pretty consistently is that in the homes where children have been victims of sexual abuse, oftentimes their caregivers have also been victims themselves as either children or recently as domestic violence survivors. And so we're thinking about all these intersections of this different kind of violence. And I think that's what really brings me to this work personally, is that I think about all the violence we have in society and where that's rooted at. And a lot of it starts off in the home. So when we think about all the things that are in the news about community violence and homicide, so often the people that are perpetrating those crimes are either from the homes where domestic violence was occurring, or they themselves have already participated as somebody who's caused harm in the domestic violence relationship. And so the intersections and the crossover of all these different issues is what brings us as the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center to the table to do this work and to work with all of our partners in the community to coordinate it.
And as I understand it, the Can Hope initiative, and correct me if I'm wrong because we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this, you are in the process of figuring out how to facilitate, how to create a space, how to extend what you're already doing with the children that you help, extend that range of services to adults as well. Can you kind of explain to me how that works? My experience in the field has mostly been with adult survivors. So are these going to be separate cases, or are these going to be connected to, the people that you help through this, these different programs? Are they connected to cases that come in with children? Are you starting kind of like over again? Just tell me how it works.
So I think the key is that we're using the model that we use for children, and we're using that as a way to address adult victimization. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a kid that's connected to our center whose caregiver we're going to be working with. It's going to be open to anybody who's got a victimization need around domestic violence or sexual assault. And I think one of the things that is interesting about this is it's sort of based on what's called a family justice center model.
Okay.
And so if you look up family justice centers, you'll see that they're in several cities throughout the country. It's a growing group of programs. Another way to think about this is called a multi-agency center. And so when you think about the experience of survivors, whether it's sexual assault or more especially domestic violence, from the point of victimization, people are asked, as survivors, people already under stress, experience trauma, to run around in the community to get all their own needs met.
Right.
They have to go here for legal services. They have to go there for social support. They have to go there to try to work out their housing situation. Maybe they have some issues around their kids. They need to go work that out. That's somewhere different still. And then we're asking them in this moment of crisis to negotiate and navigate all these systems, right? So the way that cities have chosen to address this is by establishing either a family justice center or a multi-agency center where a survivor can come in, and there are multiple service providers right there so that their services can be coordinated in one site, one visit, or they can keep coming back for multiple visits, but now they're familiar with the space and the providers are working together. So it makes everything more effective and more efficient. And so you're probably wondering like, well, obviously in Chicago we have these problems, so why don't we have this solution already when other cities do? I cannot really adequately answer that question other than to say Chicago, right? Like there's all this bureaucracy and red tape and turf and everything else that makes it difficult. So we enter this space saying Chicago has almost an embarrassment of riches in terms of services available. It's not enough in terms of volume, but the variety of service providers in the city, their geographic locations, they're available to people. They just need to be better coordinated, and we need more of them.
Well, I understand how the process works with the children because we were talking extensively with Shar Rivette about that. But where are the adult survivors going to come from? Are you going to be dealing with referral? We talked about, 911 calls, DCFS, police situations. How will the process start for somebody seeking your help from you as an adult?
So what we're doing right now is we're developing with government and service agency partners what's called a coordinated community response, so that anywhere somebody who's a survivor shows up, they would be able to learn about the center and either receive a referral from there or at least get the knowledge about where it's at and what's available to them, and they can walk in on their own. So the hotline, so the domestic violence hotline would be a place where they could call. If they were interacting with somebody from a rape crisis center in a hospital setting, they could set themselves up for follow-up services at Can Hope with that same provider and with other people that are also in that center.
But you know as well as all of us here at this table that disclosure is not an easy thing to do. I mean, I'm trembling at the very thought that in order to avail himself of these services, somebody has to come in and say, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. What you gonna do with me?
Right.
So, I mean, it sounds like maybe this is all coming from other agencies, but I'm still kind of puzzling over how this works. I know how it works as a child. I still don't really understand how an adult person gets started.
Yeah, this
Because
is
I don't see how they can do it without disclosing, and we all know that's a tough area and that's an
it
advocate.
is a tough area, and I think that's when you show up for a medical issue at a hospital, you show up and you say, I've got a problem, right? And I think, or I need some help. And so that is a first step for a lot of survivors. What we're trying to do by having a center with co-located services is to make it more approachable, to make it easier, and to also serve as a foundation for advocacy and education for the entire community. Because what we need to really do is reduce the stigma, right?
Yeah.
So last year alone, there was about 140,000 plus calls for service about domestic violence to the Chicago Police Department. And that could be neighbors, that could be the victim themselves. That's somebody recognizing that there's violence going on right now. So that's an acute episode of it. That's 140,000 calls for services. It's estimated that there's over 3 million survivors of domestic and sexual violence in the state of Illinois. So these are folks who need services, who want to go out and possibly partake in those things, but because of the stigma, because of the inconvenience, because of the sophistication or the bureaucracy or the challenges and obstacles involved, they're not seeking services. So we're trying to change culture too, I think, by establishing this sort of a multi-agency center. And that information, by the way, every year there's an organization in the city here. It's called the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence. It's based in Chicago. I already shared the link earlier today with Derek. They put out a data report every year that's based on publicly available information and also their research and insights that has all these kind of numbers about the scope of sexual violence, domestic violence, and other gender-based violence, right? So that stuff's out there. The scope of the problem is overwhelming.
So, like we were talking about before the podcast, you educated me, and it was amazing on ICEJA and VOCA funded initiatives. So, how does that for the Can Hope project? How does ICEJA and VOCA, the funding, tie into it?
Yeah, so currently there's no VOCA funding for, there's no ICEJA generated VOCA funding.
Okay.
What Chicago CAC did is we went out into the grant world, and we saw that the Office for Violence on Women in this Department of Justice and federal government was doing grants to improve the criminal justice response to domestic violence. And so we pursued that grant, and it's about a $650,000 grant over 4 years. And it's to plan and begin the implementation of a multi-agency center or a family justice center. And so we recognized the confluence of these problems, right? The sexual violence against kids, and that their caregivers have often been victims. And we recognize that this is a problem that we really need to be involved in solving. I would add that the one place that we've already gotten some VOCA money from ICEJA for is something called a multi-victimization grant. So we've already run a mini pilot for this project, and it's super successful. We have a sub-agreement with an agency that co-locates with us. They're a big domestic violence provider in the city of Chicago called Mujeres Latinas en Acción. You may have heard of them. They provide a whole array of services, and primarily they focus on survivors whose language preference is Spanish, but they serve everybody. And so when we noticed the high number of kids whose caregivers had been victims or survivors of domestic abuse, we recognized we needed some help. So Mujeres has people in our office. So when we screen caregivers of the children who come in for services now about domestic violence, and they acknowledge that they might want help with that, we just walk them to that office and connect them immediately. That's the kind of thing we want to do with Can Hope, Gene, is to make sure that when people have to tell their story, because it is something you're going to have to do at some point to get the service, that they only have to tell it once.
Right.
That's kind of the gold standard here, is you come in and you tell it once, and now everybody's working with you and that information. You don't have to go through to this office, this location, that court, this service center, and explain yourself over and over and over again.
Jason, I'd be curious, as you get the doors open for Can Hope, are there lessons learned, knowledge that from other cities that have done this that would come to bear that you're thinking about that would be applicable, that you apply here to make it run more efficiently, smoother, easier for the survivors?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to drop a bunch of things on you real quick. One is called the Alliance for
Well,
Hope.
we can take it. We can take it.
I hope everybody at home's got their notebooks and their pens. One's called the Alliance for Hope International. And so it is sort of the affiliate organization or the coalition for family justice centers. And it's based in San Diego. And they have done a lot of the advocacy for this kind of a center. And so through them, we're connected to a bunch of other people doing this work. Fun fact, for those of you who are listening outside of Chicago, like our friends out in Rockford, I'd give a shout out to the Rockford Peace Center. They're currently
Peace Center.
they're currently the only family justice center in Illinois. And it's because their mayor got behind it deep, and because they got a police department that really gets it in terms of what domestic violence does to the community. And they decided that this was a program they needed to have. So we visited there. We visited Nashville. Shar, who has been on a previous episode with you all, she's been to Charlotte to visit what they're working on. And we're going to continue going to visit and learn these lessons. The key lessons in terms of establishing these places and why Chicago hasn't had one yet is you have to have a mayor who says, this is the problem. And one of the things that got Rockford there is that they did a study and they kind of ran some data, and they recognized that for juvenile offenders, people out there committing serious crimes when they're still kids, almost 70% of them at the place where they were living had a call for service related to domestic violence. So we know that there are kids living in homes that are, where there's violence, where they're experiencing violence. And then they're going to go out in the world as survivors themselves, but they're not healed, right? And they're subject to this violence. They're going to go out and there's going to be more violence as a result of that.
Have they tracked the metrics on sexual violence?
I don't know if they have on all that, but we know that when there's violence in the home, that it hurts the kids. And so part of what Chicago CAC is doing, and everybody that I'm sure you talk to in the service provider world, we're providing direct services right now to somebody, but we're also thinking about breaking this cycle of violence in society.
Yes.
Right. And you can only do that if you help survivors heal.
Especially in Chicago, one of the, I'm sure the talking points in the last mayoral election was, crime in the city. I'm born and raised in Chicago. I've seen every side of it. And a lot of these young people, they're, probably 14, 15, 16 years old, are the victims of abhorrent things in their childhood. They never got the proper treatment, and now you're seeing it playing out across the city of what happens when they don't have help.
Yeah, and I would argue that what the work that I know that you worked on, Gene, with arts and healing, I mean, that's a critical piece of it. Therapy is a critical piece of it, but prevention is a big part of it. And I think if you want to have a safe city, you need to have safe neighborhoods. If you want to have safe neighborhoods, you have to have safe homes.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
I would also like to interject there that from my experience and the experience of most of the people I've worked with, there is really no domestic violence without sexual violence. It's just that for most of the women who've experienced both, not that either one is easier to talk to, but I think you feel you get more results when you say my husband beats me than when you say my husband raped me. Because there's just still people that don't see that as a crime. But if a guy's beating you up, he's going to rape you too.
Right.
Yeah, I think, and it's such. So there are folks out there that are much more expert on actually the violence that's involved in domestic violence. You think about all the aspects of it: the emotional, the financial, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. Of course, it is so complex, and the impact is so deep for some folks. And we need to be able to step into that void. I know before this we were talking about funding, right? And the challenge about the funding is that so much of this, it's not a marketplace, right? We're not selling goods. These are folks who need services, and they need services because society let them down in some way, right? So the funder of first resort for that should be society in general. And the way that we organize society's funding is through government, right? So one of the main funding sources for any kind of program is going to be federal funding, right? Any kind of service program. And that's true of education. That's true of, in many cases, healthcare, at least from the research aspect of it, before it becomes a marketplace. But for victim services, the number one funder is really the federal government, right? And VOCA is the biggest funder for that. And that's the Victims of Crime Act assistance money, and that money gets doled out to the states by a formula, and then each state has to dole that out to organizations that serve people directly. It really is a big focus on direct services. So we do see for Can Hope, which again is the Chicago Advocacy Network for Hope, we would see that a lot of what we're going to be doing there is both directly and then through partners on site delivering services. So we hope that a lot of that would be VOCA funded, but VOCA funding, government funding together is not sufficient
Right.
to meet the need. And I know Kristen will come on and talk about the funding mix for the capital campaign because we still need to build a building. We're going to do a pilot program off-site. We need space for that still, by the way. So if you've got, 8,000 square feet you're looking to part with on the west or southwest sides of the city, we'd be happy to occupy that. But, it's a complex funding mix. The city of Chicago has already committed to some money for our capital campaign. But we need a lot of money for services and ongoing support for victims.
With that being said, Jason, I'm curious, we've talked about this on a number of our previous podcasts. Does this create more opportunity for companies, corporations to get behind something like the Can Hope? Are we seeing that in other cities where this has been set up, that companies, corporations, the funding is coming in at an increased rate than we might typically see?
I don't know how well other cities have been able to leverage that philanthropic funding. One of the neat opportunities about Chicago is that we have an amazing philanthropic community, and Kristen is going to be much more knowledgeable about that, and she'll shed some more light on it. I think what I would say is that we really need to find ways, and I think this goes to your concern, Gene, about people having to seek services. You're going to have to tell your story once, but then, we're not the kind of place where we're going to put people on display and say, if you give $1,000, you help this person, or if you give on a corporate level $3 million over the next 5 years, then we're going to be able to help, Susie and Johnny and so on. So we have to get people to buy into this vision that, first of all, domestic violence and sexual assault are very harmful to the fabric of our community. They're very harmful to kids. They hurt all of us, whether or not we are directly impacted. The second thing is that the economic impact, and this is the other thing Rockford did a great job of, and I don't know their numbers off the top of my head, but they were able to show the economic impact to the city of domestic violence and sexual assault. Missed days at work, extra insurance claims, childcare issues, kids missing schools. All this kind of stuff plays itself out in the economic life of the community. So if you're a corporation and you're sitting around saying, well, where should we give our philanthropic dollars to? Like, I don't want to diminish the need of any charitable organization, but I will say, if you want return on investment, you have to look at domestic violence and sexual assault. You're taking people out of society when they are trying to get through, especially the acute phase of being a victim and become a survivor. It is overwhelming, the things that we ask people to do. They can't go to work. They can't focus on their kids. They need additional supports. The price is high. So it's a great return on investment, I think, for philanthropy to get involved.
That was a point we made on the a couple podcasts. We talked about this, but with Shar, we were saying, we pulled up the $9.1 billion was the total cost of just child sexual abuse in 1 year to Americans. And it just creates a negative feedback loop. So if we don't create if we don't prevent it, and we don't, I guess I'm not thinking the right word, but treat it, when it happens, it's going to continue to cost, just let's say Chicago, way more money. So if you could get people to think about, like, they're investing in, there is an ROI there, right?
Yeah, it's a huge ROI. And I think the other thing, there's three things that we learned from Rockford, and we also got this message from Nashville. You need supportive government, right? But to get supportive government, you often need to win the argument with the corporate community, and you need the voters to be on board, right? Citizens to be on board. And the three big things are, it's the right thing to do. It saves us a ton of money, right? We're investing in the future. We want to have safe communities, all that stuff. There's always this talk about people moving out of the city. Well, you want people to move in the city, you have to have safety and support for people. But the third thing is a lot of folks will talk about the impact on law enforcement. So I talked about over 140,000 calls for service just for domestic violence. That's, hey, we need help right now. Somebody comes out, they have to assess that scene. Those are very dangerous scenes, is what we hear from law enforcement all around the country. And they're ill-equipped to really problem solve in the way that they would want to.
Right.
Because they're not always trauma-informed or survivor-friendly, because their training is really about interrupting violence. It's not about starting the healing process. Now, Chicago Police Department has made some great strides, I think, in identifying liaisons to deal with these problems and connecting people with services, but not on the scale of the problem, right? And so that's the big challenge here in the city is how do you take the third largest city in the country and figure out how to make this go?
Well, they're not the experts, and they shouldn't be. And that was a point that Shar made very clearly in our previous podcast, was that, your agency serves as the expert partners, that fills in that gap that the police, that the police and DCFS need to have, on board. And, I love the idea of, being able to offer that same kind of partnership to what I think of as the first responders. I just don't see it working quite the same way as it does when the people identifying there's more self-identification, and they're adults. And it's not quite the same as it is as taking care of the children.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the key thing that we're doing that's going to be different is that the adults don't need to work with law enforcement. They don't need to work with anybody other than service providers if that's what they want. And we really are centering the, you talk about how to center survivors, and you talk about choice and voice, right? You want to make sure that people are heard, that they don't need to repeat themselves, that they don't need to always be asking for things. You want to be able to anticipate some of those needs. But they always want to give people choice in how they want to address their own situation. And I think Can Hope is just one more option for people, right? It gives them one more alternative, one more place to go. It also gives the community of providers, who's really been the backbone of this program development process, all these different provider organizations. I know that you had Resilience on a previous call. They're one of our partners. Mujeres Latinas en Acción is one of our partners. Pretty much anybody who's involved in domestic violence, any of the large agencies in the city, are partners with us in this development, because they don't see it as a threat, which we can sometimes get into when we're all seeking the same funding. They see it as an enhancement of what they're doing. They see it as an efficiency, and they see it as a support for the work that they're already doing in the community with survivors. And so that's the space that we're able to enter this from.
Which brings up an interesting thing that I just thought of. Do you have enough agency partners? Are you looking to form new partnerships?
Yeah, so we're definitely in the market for new partners. And I think one of the things that people miss out on, and this goes to the point about access to services and who people choose to tell and what those people can do in terms of getting connected. So we know that people, when they're in acute situations, they call law enforcement sometimes, or they go to a hospital for injuries. But a lot of times people are telling other folks in the community about what's going on. They're telling their pastor or their imam, or they're talking to their rabbi about what's happening, or they're reaching out to, the kids are reaching out to people at school and talking to their counselor. So what we need to do, and what kind of the next phase of our program development is to get out in the community some more, to find organizations that aren't focused on providing services to survivors, but who are definitely in contact with survivors a lot. We want to bring them into the fold. We want to find out how we can help them and how we can be a conduit for them to connect the people in their community to the services that they need.
We've straddled that interesting divide between programs and administration, the ones that so many people, are having trouble crossing, having trouble integrating. And we really appreciate the opportunity of having a guest that can really handle both. Thank you.
What an amazing to hear about this great asset.
We've already convinced Jason that he has to come back.
Yeah,
he will come back.
One more podcast, so you will see him again. I don't want to wrap things up today without one more time thanking the Awakenings people for providing us with this wonderful home. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you to Laura Kinter the executive director at Awakenings, who is also acting as our fiscal sponsor. And, you know, you can't say the word fiscal without reminding people out there that we need you. We need your help. We need your support. We are taking each podcast up to a level I never even dreamed of. We are providing not only a forum to talk about the things that people don't want to talk about, but who desperately need to talk about. And we're doing it in a way and in a format that is beautifully produced. It is broadcast quality. And if we're going to continue to do this, you need to get to our website, and yes, it's up. You need to help us figure out a way to become financially sustainable.
You need to subscribe to our, you're going to see the link popping up right now on your screen, and it'll give you the option to subscribe. Thank you again, Jason. Can't Hope, like Tom was saying, a huge, valuable resource to Chicago, and just want to thank you for coming on.
I appreciate your hospitality. Thank you.
Great to
Thank you.
see you.